10 disturbing stories involving babysitting. One of the spookiest urban legends out there is the babysitter and the man upstairs. The scenario is quite frightening. A young girl is babysitting one night when she starts getting threatening phone calls from an anonymous figure. When she notifies the police, they inform her that the threatening calls are coming from inside the house. Even though the above situation is fictional, as are the many cases of teenage babysitters being stalked and murdered in movies, urban legends often do have some basis in fact. Babysitting can sometimes be a frightening experience in which it's easy to feel vulnerable, especially since plenty of real-life cases involving babysitters have ended in terrifying things happening. 1. The murder of Jeannette Chrisman. Ann Cornett remembers it vividly. It was a Sunday morning, and her family was preparing to head off to church services. Amid the preparations, the phone rang, and as her mother listened to the voice on the other end, she uttered a soft groan and her face went pale. Ann's father turned the radio to KFRU. As church time approached and then passed, no one in the room budged. Less than 30 minutes later, the stunned group heard a knock at the door. A Columbia police officer said he wanted to interview 13-year-old Ann. He wanted to know about a recent excursion some girls from Jefferson Junior High School had taken to the University of Missouri Francis Quadrangle to pose for photos. The officer asked whether anyone had harassed or stalked the girls that day. Ann said, "No, nothing aside from the usual hollers of hubba hubba." Then, the officer asked for a photo Ann had taken. The photo was of her friend Jeannette Chrisman, posing on a stone bench in the quadrangle. The girl was shown squinting slightly in the sun and wearing a black poodle skirt and bobby socks, smiling through a smear of red lipstick. Chrisman's legs are outstretched and her figure, recalled Cornett, was noticeably more developed than other girls her age. The next day, March 20, 1950, that photo appeared on the front page of the Tribune. Jeannette Chrisman had been murdered while babysitting. An intruder raped, beat and strangled her using an iron cord. "It was the day when my little world fell apart," Cornett, now Anderson, said recently. "I couldn't sleep, I would cry and cry and cry." For Chrisman's classmates, the murder, still unsolved, has hung over their heads like a dark cloud for 60 years. Some, like Meredith Busher Jackson, 73, said she couldn't stay home alone for decades afterward. "I was always so afraid," she said. Others said parents went to great lengths to shield them from reading the newspaper or learning the details of the crime. The murder marked a sort of end of innocence for Columbia. In a town of 31,000, where many doors were often left unlocked, hardware stores began to sell out of deadbolts and latches. In a town where people knew each other's names, postal carriers reported that women refused to open their doors to receive packages. Babysitters became impossibly scarce on Saturday nights. "The town and the schools were just traumatized," said George King, a classmate who now lives in Florida. "They didn't do a lot of counseling back then like they do now. It was just kind of hushed. Kids didn't know what to say, what to do. There was a lot of hurt. Everybody was frightened to death." Quite honestly, the night of March 18, 1950, was an ugly one. Gusting winds blew rain and sleet around, and few people ventured outdoors in mid-20-degree temperatures. There was an 8th grade party that night, but Jeannette Chrisman did not attend. The girl had agreed to babysit the 3-year-old son of Mr. and Mrs. Ed Romick. She told friends she needed the money to make the last payment on a new burgundy-colored suit she had purchased for Easter. Jeanette's parents owned Ernie's Cafe and Steakhouse and lived above the shop. The small, one-story Romick home sat perched on Slide Hill on Stewart Road just outside of what was then Columbia's western limit. Before leaving for a card game at 7:50 p.m., Ed Romick showed Chrisman how to load and fire his shotgun. He also instructed her to turn on the bright porch light before answering the door if anyone came calling. Little Greg, her 3-year-old charge, liked to sleep with the radio turned on and wouldn't cause her much trouble, she was told. The inclement weather meant things were fairly quiet for police, but at 10:35 p.m., Officer Roy McCowan received a jarring phone call. A girl was screaming hysterically on the other end, and McCowan heard the words "come quick." The connection, however, broke off before the girl could identify herself. At that late hour, the test board at the telephone company was not staffed, and the call couldn't be traced. At about 1:35 a.m., the Romicks returned home to find the front Venetian blinds open and the porch light illuminated. Both the front and back doors were unlocked, and a side window was broken open. Chrisman lay in a pool of blood on a shag carpet by the family piano. It appeared the 135-pound girl put up a valiant fight against her attacker. Investigators found evidence of a struggle that stretched from the phone in the kitchen through the hallway to the living room at the front of the house. There were wounds on both sides of her head, including puncture marks that appeared to have been made by a small metal instrument. Her face appeared to have been scratched by fingernails, and the cause of death was ruled asphyxiation. The apparent weapon, an iron cord that had been ripped. A sheriff's deputy would later characterize it as an inside job because of the assailant's apparent familiarity with the house. The Boone County Sheriff's Department arrived in short order and had primary jurisdiction in the matter. Bloody fingerprints were taken, and Sheriff Glenn Powell ordered bloodhounds brought in from Algoa Correctional Center. The hounds tracked a trail from the home through heavy underbrush to the corner of West Boulevard and West Ash Street but lost the scent there. Police Chief E.M. Pond asked the public to report anybody who acted strangely. Missed work or showed up with visible scratches in the days after the murder. But it didn't take long for the investigation to hit some snags. Although the murder took place in the county, city police played a muscular role in the investigation, much to the chagrin of Sheriff Powell. Paul Chivins, who later served as police chief for 21 years, joined the force the week after the murder as one of 4 new patrolmen hired to quell public panic. One of his first assignments from Pond was to sit in the Romick house from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. for 12 consecutive nights on the off chance the perpetrator returned to the scene. It was not a pleasant duty at all, said Chivins, now 86. Chivins' presence in the house was one of several things that led to tension between the two law agencies. In the days after the murder, a member of the Carpenters Union said he was beaten while in police custody as a suspect in the case. Dozens, possibly hundreds, of suspects were interviewed and then excluded from consideration by police, including one student who erroneously confessed to the crime. Often this occurred without consulting Powell. There was very little cooperation between the two agencies at that time, said Chivins. I was outside the city limits when I was in the Romick house. In retrospect, I had no business out there. Pond ordered all officers to 12-hour shifts. He changed the emergency number from 3132 to the easier-to-dial 112 and deputized a number of prominent downtown businessmen to watch the streets at night. Tribune columnist Warren Dalton, then owner of Suzanne's and president of the Junior Chamber of Commerce, recalled being given a badge and deputized. Dalton remembers one night at about 2:30 a.m., Pond and a group of men came across a suspicious character on Westwood Avenue. The chief jumped out of the car, and the man ran between 2 buildings. Dalton said, the chief shot, but he missed him. He ducked around the building, and we never caught him. He was running as fast as he could. But Dalton, too, was discouraged that the investigation never seemed to gain real traction. I don't know whether it was a thorough investigation or not, Dalton said. That's a question, whether they followed all the leads they had and as quickly as they could. You always heard a lot of rumors at that time. But even so, Powell soon focused his investigation on one man, Robert Mueller. Mueller was a friend of Ed Romick and had been over to the family's house on multiple occasions. According to testimony later introduced to a grand jury, Mrs. Romick felt frightened and uncomfortable around him and said he had run his hand across her dress 2 days before when they were alone. Ed Romick, too, submitted damning testimony saying that Mueller had once told him he admired Chrisman's well-developed form. He had known she would be babysitting in the Romick home that night because he had asked her to babysit at his own home. Romick also told police that Mueller, at one point, told him plainly, I might have done it and then forgotten it. Mueller carried a mechanical metal pencil that had a round punch end that generally matched the puncture wounds on Chrisman's head. But the case against Mueller became problematic. On May 4th, the sheriff brought Mueller to the farmhouse of Deputy Sheriff Julius Windermere for an all-night questioning session. The next day, apparently unsatisfied with his answers, Powell took him to Jefferson City to undergo a lie detector test. The prosecuting attorney was not told about the questioning, and the sheriff did not request an arrest warrant for Mueller. It was later alleged that Powell kept the prosecuting attorney out of the loop because he was worried about his ties to the police chief. On May 24th, Judge W.M. Dinwiddie impaneled a grand jury to examine the matter, releasing findings on June 17. The grand jury did not return an indictment of Mueller and, instead, excoriated the police and sheriff's departments for not working together. In the opinion of the grand jurors, much of the effort expended has been wasted and dissipated because of the failure to correlate the information available. Read the jury report. The report continued to blame petty jealousies that fueled an almost complete lack of cooperation between the various law enforcement agencies. Soon afterward, Mueller joined the Air Force and left Colombia. He later attempted to sue Powell and 2 deputies for violating his civil rights during the questioning but lost the case. He died in 2006 at the age of 83. Glenn Powell's nephew, Wayne Powell, who was 15 at the time of the murder, said his uncle remained convinced of Mueller's guilt the rest of his life. He believed Mueller had used family connections to obscure evidence and beat the charge. It really bothered him. I think up until the day he died it bothered him, Powell said. As the 60th anniversary of the death approaches, Mary Beth Brown, a manuscript specialist at the Western Historical Manuscript Collection at MU, has done extensive research on it. Her work and that of amateur historian Joan Sorrells constitute the basis for much of this article. Brown has explored possible links between the murder and that of another girl, Mary Lou Jenkins, who was killed 2 blocks away from the Romick home in 1946. Jenkins was strangled with an extension cord, and Floyd Cochran, a trash hauler, admitted to the murder and was sentenced to death. He recanted his confession before his execution. Brown also has researched a string of other rapes and peeping Tom incidents that occurred between 1946 and 1950 in Colombia. Last fall, Brown, who has a long-standing interest in unsolved murders, gave a presentation at MU titled Murder, Mystery and Mayhem that examined several notable cases, including that of Chrisman. More than 70 people attended, she said, a record for such events. Afterward, she was surprised to be surrounded by women in their 70s all wanting to know what else she could tell them about the Chrisman case. These were her classmates, and they hadn't forgotten. It really piqued my interest, Brown said. One of the women who vividly remembers Chrisman is Carol Haley Holt. In an interview, Holt, 73, recalled spending long afternoons singing with Chrisman as Jeannette accompanied her on the piano. Several days after the murder, Holt said she was called out of class at Jefferson Junior High by the principal and asked to accompany him to Chrisman's locker. She was told to gather up the books and gym clothes there and make the half-mile walk to Ernie's to return the clothing to Chrisman's mother, Lula Mae. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, Holt said. I couldn't talk, and she probably couldn't, either. For all the intervening years as Holt got married, had 4 children, had grandchildren and became widowed, she said the image of Jeannette Chrisman laying on that bench has stayed engraved in her mind. Even today, she holds out hope that someone might have answers about what happened that night. Can't say I think about it every day, but, yes, I think about what she missed and the tragic way it happened, said Holt. I think about it and wonder, how much did she suffer? I'd like to find out who did this and how could they do this to her, this girl who had never in her life done anything to anyone. 2. The disappearance of Lori Jean Lloyd. When Jim Lloyd reflects on his youngest sister, whom he has not seen for 36 years, tears flow easily, and so do the feelings of guilt. I didn't have time for her, Lloyd said. We did tease her a lot. His sister, Lori Jean Lloyd, vanished February 10, 1976. As she walked from her family's home at 3303 Annabelle Drive toward a 7-Eleven on Wilmington Pike to purchase cigarettes. Police don't believe she ever made it to the store, and the girl, then 14, has not been seen since. Her siblings, including Jim Lloyd, who was 18 when his sister disappeared, and their mother have all struggled with feelings of guilt ever since. This is not uncommon, according to experts. The Dayton Daily News and News Center 7 spent 2 months examining cold case homicides and missing persons reports. The family members interviewed described the agony of not knowing what happened to their loved ones, or who was responsible. They discussed going through scenarios repeatedly, trying to get answers for what has been so far unanswerable. They also described examining their own behavior and looking for those answers. The idea that's often discussed is that folks focus on closure, said Art Gibson, a sociologist and director of criminal justice studies at the University of Dayton. Mysteries tend to interrupt the usual flow of relationships. I couldn't save her. Cold cases bring frustration. Some murders go unsolved and killers slip through the cracks. Time passes and the families of the victims lose hope. They also feel guilty because they were not there to help and because there has been no justice for their loved one. Carla Davis was 6 months pregnant when she was murdered 13 years ago. What her killer did to her, investigators said, was one of the most gruesome crimes they had ever seen. Carla's murder also haunts her mother, Rosetta Bird of Dayton. "This time I couldn't save her. I was not there to say goodbye," said Bird. "The only thing I can say is, Carla, I'm so sorry I wasn't there to help you. Sorry I wasn't there when you took your last breath. I'm sorry I was not there to hold you in my arms. Sorry that I let you down." In the early morning hours of August 11, 1991, somebody attacked and beat the 21-year-old woman and then set her body on fire. Rosetta Bird says she is still struggling because the killer is still free. She says she can't move on because there has been no justice for Carla. The Davis case was recently reopened by Detective Patricia Tackett of the Dayton Police Cold Case Unit. "It breaks my heart when I see this. That's why I do what I do," Tackett said. The Lloyds did not speak of Lori's disappearance for years. In 1999, they began speaking about it after they held a memorial service. That opened up communication, and family members compared notes on what they were thinking and feeling and when. "I thought she was too trusting," Jim Lloyd said. "She didn't think anybody, besides her sisters and brothers, was mean." Joni Spencer, the eldest sister, who described herself as a second mother to Lori, remembers that "I blew it off when Lori first went missing, thinking that she had run away again." Their mother, Anita Smith, who developed an alcohol addiction after her daughter's disappearance, said she even felt guilt about moving from the house on Annabelle, thinking that, if Lori were to return, that's where she would go. "I stayed in my house for years, even after I wanted to move," Smith said. Anita Ping, whose son Donald has been missing since 2002, said she believes her son is dead. "She wakes up thinking about him most mornings, and thinks about him when she lays down to sleep, replaying scenarios in her head about what might have happened. This way, you don't really know who to be mad at," Ping said. "You pray for that all the time. Just let me know." Gibson said that family members of cold case victims feel an overwhelming loss of control, leading them to speculate and blame themselves, questioning what they could have done to prevent what happened. "We strive to find a logical explanation," Gibson said. "These people have to manage ambiguity and to manage uncertainty in a way that most of us may not ever have to do. This is particularly pertinent in disappearance cases, because you have no evidence to go on, so you have to manufacture evidence," Gibson said. "People do that by speculating on the ambiguities that existed in the relationships they had with the victim, or to micro-examine the specifics of their own behavior. But in most cases," Gibson said, "the answers aren't there. The survivors likely had nothing to do with the creation of that mystery." "You can't possibly plan for every contingency," Gibson said. "Of course, you're going to let your child out in the world. You have to." Anita Smith, who was having dinner with a friend the night Lori vanished, said she's gone through all of that. Though she still sometimes expects a knock at the door, she said she knows it's not likely. The computer-generated pictures of Lori, showing what she would look like at age 50, show a stranger to her, and she wonders if, should Lori ever return to their lives, they could really begin again as family. But she also wonders if the mystery is really a blessing, she said. "I don't know if we could handle what happened to Lori," Smith said. "Maybe not knowing is not as bad as knowing." 3. The murder of Jaidyn Leskie. Accused murderer Greg Damaschwitz has admitted his stupidity was to blame for the death of toddler Jaidyn Leskie, but he still denies killing the 14-month-old in 1997. Speaking about one of Victoria's most notorious murders for the first time in several years, Mr. Damaschwitz told the Herald-Sun he considers he is responsible for Jaidyn no longer being alive. "Jaidyn would have turned 18 this month. It's upsetting, still, because ultimately there's a kid that died because of my stupidity," Damaschwitz said. In 1998, Mr. Damaschwitz, who had been the boyfriend of Jaidyn's mother, Violenta, was acquitted of the murder of Jaidyn. He maintains his innocence, saying that, as he told police, he left Jaidyn home to go and pick up Violenta from a pub, and Jaidyn wasn't there when they got back. "Ultimately, it was my fault. I was the one who got in the car and went to pick her up," Mr. Damaschwitz said. Approached by the Herald-Sun at his home last month, he revealed he had fathered a son 10 years ago, but separated from the mother a few years ago. Asked how often he got to see the boy, he said, as often as I like. Mr. Damaswich said being reminded that Jaidyn would have turned 18 on April 30th had brought memories flooding back. I wish I had never left him at home that night, he said. How many lives have changed from that one decision not to stay home? Jaidyn would have been a man now. He'd be driving and everything else. Changes to double jeopardy laws since the acquittal opened the possibility he could be charged again. He told the Herald-Sun he doubted that would happen, but he'd have nothing to fear if it did. There's a lot more evidence going away from me than towards me, he claimed. He said beating a murder charge again would enable him to sue his accusers. In 2006, then State Coroner Graham Johnston found Mr. Damaswich had contributed to Jaidyn's death by throwing the toddler's body into a mow dam. Mr. Damaswich said he believed Jaidyn was alive for months after he disappeared. If so, he couldn't be the killer because he was under constant police surveillance from when Jaidyn was reported missing on June 15, 1997. He said Jaidyn's body was well preserved when found in a sleeping bag in a mow dam in January 1998, showing, he said, that the body hadn't been submerged for 6 months. He was found, like, a lot bigger than how he went missing, Mr. Damaswich said. The thing is, how did he grow? If he was in the water in that bag, how come that bag could rot? And yet he was alright? He said. He also recently told the Herald-Sun that prisoners who claimed he had confessed to them had lied. He said if he had killed Jaidyn and was going to confess, it would have happened in the years since his acquittal, considering he had discussed the case with people while drinking and using drugs. I have never once at any stage even, like, whether you want to call, slipped, or said or mentioned anything, Mr. Damaswich said. How come since then, like, not one person has said, oh, did you know that one day, this and that? How come that has not happened in, like, 15 years? Mr. Damaswich was unwilling to discuss with the Herald-Sun his strong underworld connections. He was one of the last to speak to hitman Andrew Benji Veneman before Mick Gatto shot the killer dead, and was a friend of late murderer and drug dealer Carl Williams. Detectives from the Piranha Gangland Killing Task Force discovered Mr. Damaswich spoke to Veneman just 2 hours before Gatto shot Veneman dead in Carlton's La Porcella restaurant on March 23, 2004. Gatto was charged with murdering Veneman but was acquitted after arguing the shooting was in self-defense. Detectives made the link from the telephone records of Veneman, and found that Mr. Damaswich had a long-standing relationship with him and with Carl Williams and Williams's wife, Roberta. Mr. Damaswich hung up on the Herald-Sun in 2004 when asked about the call to Veneman, but Mr. Damaswich's lawyer, Michael Rafter, confirmed his client knew Veneman and the Williams. He said Mr. Damaswich spoke to Veneman about 1 p.m. the day Veneman was shot. It was Roberta Williams's birthday that day, and they were talking about going out for her birthday that night, Mr. Rafter said. Police were quite rightly interested in what Benji's demeanor was, and what he said to Greg. Greg says it was just a normal everyday conversation, talking about going out that night. Nothing was mentioned about Gatto or anything like that, Mr. Rafter said. Mr. Rafter said Carl and Roberta Williams had introduced Mr. Damaswich to Veneman. He said, Benji was very kind to Greg. He used to look after him as far as money and food and so on was concerned. Greg appreciated what Benji did for him, and was shattered by his death. Mr. Damaswich was able to slip past waiting media to attend Veneman's funeral. The relationship with the Williams couple was strong enough for them to invite him to their daughter Dakota's christening at Crown Casino's plush Palladium room. Mr. Rafter confirmed that Mr. Damaswich had been one of the guests who attended the lavish celebration in December 2003. 4. The suspicious babysitting activities of Susan Baker. Paul's parents, James Arthur Baker and Linda Solorzano, separated in the mid-1980s. James's affair with Susan, who was employed as their children's babysitter, caused the breakup of the marriage. Solorzano said that she moved out of their home with Paul and his 6-year-old sister Nina shortly thereafter. She claimed that James never paid child support afterwards. Solorzano had limited financial means after their separation and applied for public assistance. She was pregnant with her new boyfriend's child by the time her divorce from James was finalized. Solorzano said that the judge sided with James and agreed that she did not have the means to support Paul and Nina. James was awarded full custody of both children and married Susan afterwards. The Bakers purchased a home in Beaufort, South Carolina. By 1987, James was a sergeant at the Marine Corps Air Station there. Susan told authorities that she put Paul down for a nap inside their residence at 11 a.m. on March 5 of that year. Susan claimed she fell asleep herself after that, under the influence of alcohol and muscle relaxants, and woke up at 12:30 or 1:30 p.m. to a call from James. James called her after the station's family services notified him that a woman had called them claiming she had Paul and he was okay. Paul had vanished from the Baker's residence. He has never been seen again. An extensive search of the property produced little evidence as to Paul's whereabouts. James initially accused Solorzano of making the phone call and abducting her son, but law enforcement determined she had nothing to do with the child's disappearance and wasn't even in the state at the time he went missing. Susan took a polygraph 8 days after Paul's disappearance. The results were ruled inconclusive. 4 days after that, James took a polygraph and failed it. Susan admitted she was stressed from taking care of the children and did not want the task, and had wanted to send them back to their mother. James told investigators Susan usually disciplined the children and he thought she was too harsh with them. James suggested Susan had killed Paul and thrown his body in the Battery Creek. He said Nina might be in danger from her stepmother. The next day, however, James said he no longer believed his wife had killed his son. A search of the Baker home on March 24 revealed blood spatters which were sent away for analysis, but it's unclear what happened to them. State authorities removed Nina from the family's home 18 days after Paul's disappearance, in response to James's statements about Susan. Investigators learned that she suffered untreated broken bones and had ulcerated sores on her back. Nina said Susan beat her with a stick and locked her in a closet for long periods, and she stated Susan abused Paul as well, whipping him when he wet his bed and forcing him to stand in a corner for hours at a time. James recalled that Paul had been sick in the days prior to his disappearance and had soiled his pants in his bed. Nina said she didn't remember seeing Paul or hearing his voice at all the day he disappeared. She came home from school at 11 a.m., and Susan told her Paul was feeling better and was playing in the backyard. A short time later, she heard Susan screaming for Paul to go take a nap. Nina fell asleep and when she woke up, Susan told her brother was missing. Authorities believe she was under the influence of drugs and alcohol at the time of Paul's disappearance. Susan was charged with assault and battery on Nina with intent to kill, but pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of assault and battery of a high and aggravated nature. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but the sentence was suspended after she had served 80 days. She completed a 5-year term of probation. Solorzano was involved in a legal battle in an attempt to win custody of her daughter. Nina spent some time in foster care, was eventually placed with her maternal grandmother while Solorzano was given the opportunity to improve her life. Nina went to go live with her mother in 1992. She didn't see her father again until 2000, 13 years after she was taken from his home, and she remains estranged from him. She is now married, works as a nurse and has 3 children of her own. A former cellmate of Susan's later stated Susan had told her James had killed Paul. Susan said the child died after his father severely beat him, and she and James had buried Paul's body in a neighbor's yard. This statement has never been verified. Susan and James were extradited back to South Carolina from their Florida residence in 2000. In connection with Paul's disappearance. James had been discharged from military service in 1999, when South Carolina authorities reopened Paul's case and charged both Bakers with assault and battery of a high and aggravated nature. A grand jury refused to indict either of them. However, although they did indict Susan for child neglect, authorities elected not to pursue the neglect charge because it was a misdemeanor, and even if Susan were to be convicted, she would not be severely punished. The case went cold again. In a bizarre twist, Susan was linked to another missing child case in Florida in November 2009. Shannon Lee Dedrick, a 7-month-old baby, disappeared from her Chipley, Florida home. Susan was her babysitter and half-sister to Shannon's father, James Russell Rusty Dedrick Jr. 5 days later, Shannon was found alive and in good health, hidden in a cedar chest under a bed in Susan's home in the 3300 block of Orange Hill Road in Chipley. She'd been in the chest for about a day and a half. Authorities charged Susan and Shannon's mother, Christina Lynn Mercer, with several felonies and misdemeanors, including child neglect, custodial interference, child desertion, filing a false report and contributing to the delinquency of a child. Susan claimed Mercer had voluntarily given the baby to her to keep permanently, but then reported her missing 10 hours afterward. Authorities don't believe Rusty was aware of the situation. James was detained by police after Dedrick was found, but has since been released without charge. He said he never knew the baby was being hidden in his house. A photo of Susan is posted below this case summary. 2 months before Shannon's disappearance, she had written to the Florida governor saying Shannon's parents were drug users and she was concerned for the baby's safety. Child Protective Services investigated and Shannon's parents both received assistance and entered treatment programs. But the baby was not removed from their custody. At Susan's trial in the fall of 2010, she claimed she had only taken Shannon to protect her from her parents. Shannon was removed from her parents' care and put in a foster home after the kidnapping incident. She now lives with a relative out of state. Rusty has surrendered his rights to her, and Mercer isn't allowed to have contact with her. Susan was convicted of 3 felony charges in October 2010. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. She and James got divorced in the aftermath of Shannon's kidnapping. Mercer was called to testify at Susan's trial but refused to answer any questions, citing her Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. In late October 2010, she pleaded guilty to a single misdemeanor charge of providing false information to the police and was sentenced to 364 days in jail. She got credit for time served and was released immediately. The other charges against her were dropped. The only evidence that Mercer gave Shannon to Susan is Susan's own statement, and Susan isn't considered a credible witness, so the charges against Mercer for making a false 911 call and custodial interference cannot be proved. Paul's disappearance received additional publicity after the Dedrick story broke, but no additional evidence was uncovered in his case. Foul play is suspected in Paul's case. His whereabouts remain unknown. 5. The murder of Pamela Mason. In 1964, 14-year-old Pamela Mason posted a flyer at a laundromat in Manchester, New Hampshire, advertising her services. It wasn't long until an unidentified man answered Pamela's ad and phoned her to say he needed a babysitter. On January 13, Pamela left her home to go meet this man. 8 days later, she was found dead in a snowbank. She had been sexually assaulted, stabbed, and shot to death. Authorities noticed similarities between Pamela's death and the murder of an 18-year-old Manchester woman named Sandra Volade, which had occurred 4 years earlier. Weeks after Pamela's murder, a laundromat employee named Rena Paquette told authorities she had seen a man named Edward Coolidge taking an interest in Pamela's babysitting flyer and believed him to be her killer. The following morning, Paquette was found burned to death inside a barn on her property. After incriminating evidence was discovered in Coolidge's vehicle and his home, he was arrested and charged with Pamela Mason's murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. However, the conviction became the subject of controversy, as the searches to obtain evidence against Coolidge were believed to be unconstitutional. The case made it all the way to the United States Supreme Court in 1971, since the Attorney General of New Hampshire had personally signed the warrants to search Coolidge's vehicle and property. The Supreme Court ruled that the warrants were invalid since they were not issued by a neutral and detached magistrate. As a result, Coolidge's first-degree murder conviction was overturned. He agreed to plead to the lesser charge of second-degree murder and was released from prison in 1991. While most people are convinced that Coolidge was Pamela Mason's killer, the deaths of Sandra Volade and Rena Paquette were never solved. 6. The disappearance of Heather Cullorn. 8 years have passed with no sign of Heather Cullorn since she was last seen on July 14, 1999. She was 12 the night she disappeared. Heather was spending the night at an apartment complex in Richmond Heights, Missouri, babysitting a 2-month-old baby girl. The baby was the daughter of Dana Madden and Christopher Herbert, friends of Christine Cullorn, Heather's mom. Police have verified Dana Madden's alibi that she was working at her job at a local convenience store in the early morning hours when Heather Cullorn disappeared. Dana was still at her job when police were called to the apartment by Chris Herbert. However, no one can be certain where Chris Herbert really was when Heather went missing. Initially he claimed he was taking a friend home, then his story changed, and he told police he was making methamphetamine down by the river. with a friend. In reality, nothing can be substantiated since the people he was hanging out with were either drug dealers or drug users, and by history they tend to be an unreliable source. Whoever took Heather Cullorn left behind quite a few clues about her disappearance, yet nothing significant enough to tell anyone where she is now. One resident of the apartment complex was out walking his dog at 2 in the morning and he actually witnessed a male figure carrying a child out of the apartment in question wrapped in a light-colored blanket. He knew it was a child because he could see the legs sticking out from underneath the blanket. Unfortunately, the man is legally blind when he is not wearing his prescription glasses, and you might guess what I am about to type. He was not wearing his glasses that night. The man carrying the child out of the apartment remains unidentified, as does the child who was in the blanket. There is plenty of speculation as to who the man was and who he was carrying, yet unfortunately speculation is not evidence allowable in court. Police found DNA evidence in Dana and Chris's apartment. There was blood found on the couch and DNA tests matched the results to Heather Cullorn's blood. This evidence leads police to suspect foul play in Heather's disappearance. During the initial few hours of the investigation, while searching for Heather, police discovered a white comforter missing from the Madden and Herbert apartment. Was this comforter possibly the light-colored blanket the legally blind man witnessed a child wrapped in? There is further speculation that Heather may have been kidnapped in retaliation for a bad drug deal, for witnessing a drug interaction or drug manufacturing, or in exchange for some drug-making equipment that was stolen from a couple by Christopher Herbert. Allegedly, a note was left in the garage for Chris Herbert, the day before Heather's disappearance, from the couple wanting their drug-making equipment returned. Chris Herbert allegedly confessed to the police he did steal this equipment later during the continued investigation into Heather's absence. For now, no one has come forward to give authorities any additional information about the night Heather Cullorn disappeared. Heather is a diabetic who needs medication to help her control her diabetes, and she gets sick if she does not have her insulin. Christine Cullorn would like to know where Heather is now. All parties present the day before and the night of Heather's disappearance have denied involvement and knowledge of where Heather is at this time. Police have had a person of interest, yet unfortunately, although there are a lot of clues in Heather's disappearance, there is no evidence that allows them to pursue the case at this time. Someone knows what happened to Heather, and regardless of whether she is still here on Earth or now flying with the angels, her mother deserves to know what happened that night. No mother should have to wonder night after night where her child is and if her child is safe and warm. How cruel this world is that children go missing in the first place. There is evil that walks on our Earth, evil that rips apart families and destroys lives for their own selfish needs. In addition, any person who knows what has happened to a child and keeps quiet about the circumstances are as guilty, perhaps even guiltier, than the perpetrator that initially took the child. The person who has the ability to put an end to the unknown for a parent and family of a missing child and does not must live with the knowledge of the pain and suffering they are responsible for festering each day they remain silent. May the angels have mercy on that person when it is their time to face up to their wrongs on Earth. 7. The murder of Kelli Ann Tinyes. Convicted murderer Robert Golub has admitted killing his former 13-year-old Valley Stream neighbor, Kelli Ann Tinyes, for the first time since her 1989 slaying in an account that has only angered her family. Transcripts from Golub's November parole board hearing showed Tuesday that Golub, after years of denying he killed Kelli, accepted responsibility for her death during his failed bid for release. Golub, 46, who is serving a sentence of 25 years to life, apologized and claimed he never intended to cause Kelli's death. He described the rage he went into while killing Tinyes, saying he was using a ridiculous amount of anabolic steroids at the time. Authorities found Kelli's body in a sleeping bag in a closet in the Golub home a day after she was last seen leaving her Horton Road home and going into his family's nearby residence. Prosecutors said the teen had been strangled and sexually mutilated. Golub's version is that he came out of his room in his family's home and ran into Kelli on the stairs, knocking her down before he even saw her. According to the transcript, he said Kelli fell down the whole flight and became unconscious, which panicked him. But instead of calling for help, Golub said he became infuriated. "It felt like she was imposing on me," he said. "All of a sudden, this happened to me. I became angry." Golub told the parole board that he dragged the girl's body through the house. "I took her by the ankle and pulled her through the house, and her jacket, and her shirt, and everything rode up. "When I read she had suffocated, I believe that's what happened," he said. Golub also said he slapped Kelly's face to try and awaken her before his violence escalated. "The slaps became punches, the punches, kicks. I acted horrendously that day," said Golub, who also claimed he never sexually assaulted the victim. Golub said he brought Kelly's body to the home's basement, and then into a closet. The victim's father, Richard Tinyes, said Golub's admission brings the family no comfort. Now he's trying to say he's sorry 25 years later. "It's out of control," Tinyes said. "It doesn't bring us any justice, him saying this finally," he added. "All he's trying to do is, get himself out of jail, and for what he did, he should stay there and die." Some framed photos of a smiling Kelly were intermingled with holiday decorations in the Tinyes living room near a Christmas tree. "They'll place another by her grave soon," the family said. Golub's account only reignited their pain. "It's bringing me back to the first day it happened, and it's really hard," Vicky Tinyes, the victim's mother, said through tears. Golub told the parole board he assumed Kelly was at the house to visit his younger brother but that he wasn't sure. He said, as far as he knew, his brother and his brother's two friends were also in the house when Kelly tumbled down the stairs and he dragged her around the house. But he said there was a stereo playing upstairs, and they didn't hear what happened from the second floor. There was no mention in the transcript about a phone call prosecutors said the victim got from someone in the Golub home before she went there. The murder sparked a feud between the Golub and the Tinyes families that kept up until the Golubs moved in 2009. That same year, Golub said in a Newsday interview at Greenhaven Prison in upstate Stormville that he had nothing to do with Tinyes' murder, but Golub told the parole board he was very sorry and would live every day in his victim's memory if released from prison. He hasn't responded to a November 25 letter that Newsday mailed to the prison that asked him about his admission of guilt and parole denial. These remarks by Robert Golub do nothing but reopen wounds and cause pain where healing should happen instead, Nassau District Attorney Katelyn Rivera said in a statement. A spokesman said the investigation remains open. 8. The trial of Olivia Reiner. When the long, bungled trial of 20-year-old Olivia Reiner had finally run its course, there was one last surprise. It wasn't that Reiner, the so-called killer nanny, was acquitted. It was that it took the jury a full 12 hours to do so. Even the judge, Donald N. Silverman, went on record before the verdict saying that if the jury handed down a conviction, he would seriously consider reversing it. Tie proved unnecessary. Not guilty, said the jury foreman to the charges that Reiner had murdered 3-month-old Christy Fisher by dousing her with paint thinner and setting her on fire. The accused closed her eyes but remained immobile. The packed Westchester County courtroom gasped in relief. One spectator pumped his fist in the air. Moments later several jumped to their feet and applauded. When Olivia finally roused, tears streamed down her pale cheeks, and a huge grin spread across her face. It was one of the few times since being charged with the hideous crime that the stoic Swiss au pair had shown visible emotion of any kind. Hardly able to believe it was over, Reiner and her attorney, Laura Bravetti, 40, wrapped each other in a cathartic embrace. 7 months ago the case seemed open and shut. The police in Mount Pleasant, a leafy suburb of New York City, claimed they had proof that would send Reiner to prison for 25 years to life. At the trial's start, Assistant District Attorney George Bolin, 46, promised he would establish a reason for the seemingly wanton murder of a defenseless infant. Last December, when Reiner was first accused of killing Christy, the case turned into an international cause célèbre. Not only did the crime itself seem unspeakably evil, it also became entwined in the public imagination with the Hollywood thriller The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, a film starring Rebecca De Mornay as an outwardly charming nanny who methodically sets about destroying the family that employs her. In a near coincidence, the film was released just days after Reiner was indicted on lower counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree arson. Both the crime and the movie spoke to every parent's worst nightmare about nannies, babysitters and child care. The first call came into the local police at about 5:10 p.m. last December 2nd. "Hi, fire," Olivia Reiner, clearly agitated, told the police operator. About 5 minutes later, in a second phone call, she was edging toward hysteria. "The baby's in the room. She's heard to scream," on the police tape. Reiner had been home alone with Christy at the 2-story house of William Fisher, 48, owner of an auto repair shop, and his wife, Denise, 39, an accountant. Reiner had left Christy asleep in her nursery in a plastic car seat, where the baby often napped. The nanny, meanwhile, fed the Fissers 4 cats. Suddenly one of the cats became spooked. Reiner quickly discovered the house was ablaze. 3 separate fires had been set. John P. Gallagher III, a 26-year-old auto mechanic and the boyfriend of Leah Fisher, little Christy's 22-year-old half-sister, was the first to reach the scene. At the trial he testified that he had been on the way to the Fisher house to meet Leah. Gallagher said that he grabbed a fire extinguisher from a panicky Reiner and kicked open the nursery door, which had inexplicably been locked. The baby was on the floor in front of me. The flames were coming right off the child, he said. Gallagher claimed he extinguished the fire and saw that the child, burned over 80% of her body, was dead. Police and fire units arrived within minutes, quickly followed by Christy's distraught family. The Fissers had hired Reiner, from Weddingen, Switzerland, through the E.F. Au Pair Agency of Cambridge, Mass., to work for a year. She had previously been a pediatrician's assistant in Switzerland and, over 3 incident-free years, the babysitter for a Swiss family. William Fisher testified that before the fire he felt Reiner was an intelligent girl who enjoyed a good rapport with Christy and, though a reserved bookworm, was comfortable with the family. Gallagher was briefly questioned by police. Reiner, who speaks Swiss German and only halting English, was questioned for 10 hours straight, first at a neighbor's house and then at police headquarters. Never was an interpreter or lawyer present. Though bewildered, she steadfastly maintained her innocence. "I don't set no fire," she said over and over again to detectives. Meanwhile, Gallagher and the Fissers were automatically given immunity for their grand jury testimony. When the trial started June 2, the open-and-shut case began to collapse under defense attorney Bravetti's caustic cross-examinations. Formerly a federal organized crime prosecutor for 10 years, she deemed Prosecutor Boland's case a tale of the emperor's new clothes. Despite the promise in December of Police Chief Paul J. Oliva, now retired, that we are prepared to show that she did it, the authorities provided no physical evidence linking the au pair to the murder. The prosecution produced no incriminating fingerprints on paint thinner containers found in the house, and no traces of any fire accelerant were found on Reiner's clothes. Equally important, Boland failed to come up with a plausible motive. In fact, Bravetti argued, the police had botched the investigation. Among other things, they took no notes when they spoke to Gallagher at the scene, had discarded a blood sample found on the doorjamb near Christy's room and didn't examine the baby's incinerated car seat until 2 days after the murder. Perhaps, Bravetti implied, even favoritism was at work. Gallagher's family had close ties with the police. Indeed, Gallagher calls current police chief Anthony Provenzano Uncle Tony. One of the first officers on the scene was Gallagher's former swimming coach. And, Bravetti suggested, Gallagher had a motive for starting the 3 separate fires in the Fisher home. After the Fissers hired Olivia Reiner, they had demanded that he stop sleeping over at their house, so as not to upset the nanny. Outside the courthouse, Bravetti called Gallagher walking reasonable doubt. On the stand, Gallagher denied any involvement in the fires. Throughout the 4 weeks of testimony, Reiner seemed the very picture of wronged innocence. Dressed in demure whites or navy blues, she looked like an awkward schoolgirl, deeply concerned about their only child. Reiner's mother, Marlies, 38, a part-time secretary, remained with Olivia through the 7-month ordeal, and her father, Kurt, a regional chief of civil defense, flew over regularly to be with her. Earlier, when her parents were unable to raise Olivia's $350,000 bail, Swiss friends and strangers convinced of her innocence quickly pitched in, says Willie Reinert, a former teacher of Olivia's from Weddingen, as well as the father of 2 children for whom she babysat. "I cannot imagine that she would do anything like this. She liked children. I would have employed her as an au pair anytime." In the aftermath of the verdict, the Fissers, the Reiners and Gallagher were all left in varying states of pain. Olivia Reiner, surrounded by cameras and speaking through a translator, told reporters, "I can't be angry. I am relieved at this point. I am sorry this happened, and I am very sad." The Fissers lost their daughter. An elated Kurt chimed in, "At last we can be a family again." The Fissers, however, remained inconsolable, convinced of Olivia's guilt and Gallagher's innocence. "She wasn't as sweet as you would think," said Denise, who later added that the verdict was horrible. John Gallagher, who sat with his mother, Carol, and the Fissers at the end of the trial, reacted to Bravetti's attacks by saying, "I'd like to get up and punch her in the mouth. She made me look like an idiot." His mother, her voice cracking, added, "It's been rough on him. It's been rough on the whole family. There is tension in the house." Later, as the triumphant Bravetti whisked the Reiner family through a cheering crowd and out to a luxury sedan waiting at the curb, District Attorney Carl Vergari announced that the case would not be reopened. The Fissers made their way down to a deserted basement parking garage to retrieve their car. From their stricken expressions, one could see that their wounds will not soon heal. "It was extremely rude of the people in the courtroom to give a standing ovation and forget about the fact that we lost our baby," said a tearful Denise Fisher. "The real thing here is, we lost our baby. How do we go on?" 9. The disappearance. Katelyn Rivera Helton. Katelyn's parents, Jennifer Helton and Robert Rivera, met in Pennsylvania in 1995. Their photos are posted below this case summary. It is unclear if Jennifer was aware of Robert's criminal history at the time they began dating. Jennifer told authorities that Robert hit her at least 10 times while she was pregnant with their daughter. Katelyn was born in December 1997, and Jennifer maintained that Robert beat her 6 additional times after the child's birth. Jennifer took Katelyn and moved out of the family's residence in July 1999. She said that Robert attacked her again when she attempted to remove some of her belongings from the apartment later in the month. Jennifer filed charges against Robert and he was arrested for assault. The court ordered that Robert should only allowed 1-hour weekly supervised visits with his daughter. Jennifer attended Robert's preliminary hearing during the morning of August 10, 1999, in Boothwone, Pennsylvania. Robert was not taken into custody at that point and he saw Jennifer and her aunt sitting in a car in a nearby store's parking lot after the proceedings were completed. He attacked both women, then drove to Katelyn's babysitter's residence in Boothwone. The sitter told authorities that Robert broke her front door down, then abducted Katelyn. She claimed that she heard something hit the door as Robert left with the child. The sitter heard him call out, "Her head." The sitter said she feared Katelyn's head may have collided with the door jamb. Robert later claimed only his hand hit the jamb. Robert was driving his former girlfriend's vehicle at the time of Katelyn's abduction. His girlfriend said that he was scheduled to meet her for lunch, but he did not arrive until 5:20 p.m. and he was accompanied by Katelyn. She claimed Robert was abrasive in his manner and was driving erratically at a high rate of speed, with Katelyn in the front seat of the car and herself in the back. His girlfriend testified that they drove from her workplace in Eaton, Pennsylvania to Interstate 95 towards Delaware. She said that Robert called Jennifer along the way and arranged to meet her at a nearby Kmart store to retrieve their daughter, but he passed the establishment shortly thereafter. Robert's girlfriend told authorities that they stopped at Jennifer's residence and he began shouting for her to come outside. His girlfriend said that Jennifer told him to wait a moment and Robert feared she was calling the police to report Katelyn's abduction. He sped away from the home and dropped his girlfriend off several blocks away. Robert told his girlfriend that he would return Katelyn to her mother's home, but he continued driving elsewhere. Robert and Katelyn were seen at a Sunoco gasoline station in Chaddsford, Pennsylvania at approximately 7:17 p.m. that evening. He had been driving around Pennsylvania for the majority of the day with his daughter. An employee at the station stated that Robert purchased $2 worth of fuel at the time and departed with Katelyn in the vehicle. The witness said that she was crawling on the front seat of the car, wasn't crying and didn't appear to be injured. The worker said that Robert returned alone approximately 2 hours later and traded his watch for $10 worth of fuel. Robert was arrested shortly afterwards, but Katelyn was not recovered. Robert initially told authorities that he gave Katelyn to an unidentified couple at Longwood Gardens, a horticultural display garden in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania. A sketch of the woman he supposedly gave Katelyn to is posted below this case summary. He described the woman as 20 to 30 years old, Caucasian, 5'7" tall, with dark eyes and straight brown hair pulled back. The man, Robert said, was Caucasian, in his late 30s, 5'10" tall with a heavy build, with short dark hair and sideburns. He said the couple was driving a 1996 to 1998 Dodge Caravan with blue and white Maryland designer license plates with a picture of a bird standing on one foot. Investigators initiated an extensive search for the child, but uncovered no evidence as to her whereabouts. Katelyn has never been heard from again. Robert was charged with Katelyn's abduction and presumed murder in March 2000. Two law enforcement officers testified at Robert's pre-trial hearing and said that he insinuated he killed his daughter during interviews with authorities, telling them he would spend the rest of his life in jail if he revealed her whereabouts. Jennifer testified at Robert's trial, saying that he physically abused her and also phoned her and sent letters from prison. He refused to divulge Katelyn's whereabouts in all communications with Jennifer. Prison informants testified that Robert admitted he suffocated his daughter and buried her body intact near Elkton, Maryland on the night of August 10. He stated he removed her clothes before burial and threw them out his car window onto the median strip of southbound Route 202 in Delaware. When investigators checked this location in September 1999, they found Katelyn's size 4 sneaker and one yellow sock. Robert testified in his own defense, against the advice of his attorneys. He admitted that he never gave Katelyn to anyone at Longwood Gardens, but claimed he was telling the truth during his trial. Prosecutors pointed out that Robert's version of Katelyn's disappearance changed nearly 30 times during his conversations with authorities. He claimed that he took his daughter away from Jennifer to protect her, but he offered no evidence to support his statements. He admitted he had assaulted Jennifer many times, but stated he had never abused his daughter. Robert continued to refuse to divulge Katelyn's whereabouts, but he maintained that he did not kill the child. Robert was convicted of second-degree murder and kidnapping, and was sentenced to life plus 27 years in prison. If he had been convicted of first-degree murder, he could have faced the death penalty. Katelyn's remains have never been located. She was declared legally dead in 2002, 3 years after her disappearance. 10. Christine Falling, the babysitter killer. An oddity of occurrence was how the medical examiner referred to the death of 10-week-old Travis DeWayne Coleman, who had simply stopped breathing while in the care of babysitter Christine Falling, 19. In late June 1982, the baby had been admitted to a Tallahassee, Florida, hospital for treatment of pneumonia. Upon the boy's release, his teenage mom wanted to celebrate, so she hired Falling to watch him through the night of July 3. Falling took Travis to the rundown blue and white trailer she shared with her boyfriend in Blountstown, population 2,500, on the Florida Panhandle. By dawn, the child was dead. Crib death, or a relapse of the baby's respiratory ailment, could certainly have been the cause, but his babysitter's history made the medical examiner ponder another possibility: murder. Travis was the 5th baby to die under Falling's care. The first was on February 22, 1980. Falling was hired to watch Cassidy Johnson, 2, pet named Muffin, while her family went out to work, digging worms to sell as bait. 4 hours later, Muffin became sick. She died 3 days later, a victim, doctors at the Tallahassee hospital declared, of brain inflammation. One of the physicians examining the body, Robert Boady, said he suspected that Falling, not natural causes, had taken the baby's life, but he was ignored. A year later, 2 more of Falling's charges, cousins Jeffrey Davis, 4, and Joseph, Joe Boy, Spring, 2, died within days of each other. Doctors said the cause of death was myocarditis, or heart inflammation. On July 14, 1981, 8-month-old Jennifer Daniels died while in Falling's care, even though she had been cradled in the babysitter's arms for just a few moments. Falling was a passenger in a car driven by her stepsister, Betty Jean Daniels, 19. The 2 women had taken the baby for routine vaccinations. On the way home, Daniels left them alone to pick up some groceries. When she returned to the car, Falling announced, "The baby ain't breathing." Daniels at first said it was nothing to worry about, that babies don't breathe hard. When the young mother looked closer, she realized that this one wasn't breathing at all, and had turned blue. Family, neighbors, doctors, and the police chalked it all up to hard luck. Babies died all the time in the ramshackle towns where Falling eked out a living taking care of young'uns. There was no way, insisted people who knew her, that she would have harmed a child. They might not have been so sure of that had they known more about the background of the 5'6", 200-pound teen. As a youngster, she said she loved cats, as much as she would later profess to love babies. That didn't stop her from strangling kittens to see them die. The girl who would make headlines across the country as the killer babysitter, was born Christine Slaughter in Perry, Florida, On March 12, 1963, the daughter of a teenage mom who vanished when she was a toddler. She and her older sister Carol never knew their father. The girls stayed briefly with Tom Slaughter, the 84-year-old junkman who had briefly married their mother. Life became a series of brief stays in trailers, shacks and motels, with relatives and friends. In 1967, Dolly and Jesse Falling, of Perry, adopted the sisters, but it became a horror of misery and abuse. By 1975, Christine, now a 7th-grade dropout who suffered from epilepsy, left home. 2 years later, she had moved in with her birth mother, and entered into a brief marriage with her stepbrother. Nothing lasted. She wandered around the seedy side of the Panhandle, making money by taking care of other people's homes and children. All kinds of theories swirled around the deaths of the first 4 babies and of Wilbur Swindle, a 77-year-old cancer patient who had hired Falling as a housekeeper. The old man was easy to explain: a heart attack. As for the babies, medical examiners considered a slew of deadly possibilities: tainted food or water, germs, malnutrition, or sudden infant death syndrome. One theory held that Falling was a latter-day Typhoid Mary, an innocent carrier of a deadly disease. Speculation gave way to horror a few months after Falling's July 22, 1982, arrest for the murders of Travis and Cassidy. Rather than face a trial and a death sentence, she confessed to killing all 5 children and pleaded guilty. "I just choked him. No apparent reason," she said in a taped confession, describing Travis' murder. "The child had not been crying or acting up. I just picked him off his pallet and choked him to death and laid him back down." With Cassidy, Falling recalled that they had come inside after a play session, and she got kind of rowdy or something. "Anyway, I choked her until she quit breathing." She choked Jennifer because the child had been crying, and she put her hands around Joseph because she just got the urge. "I killed them," she said. "That's about all I got to say. I don't know why." 3 years into her life sentence, she admitted that Swindle, whose death had been ruled a heart attack, had also been a victim of her urges. She said she strangled him. The deadly babysitter came up for parole in 2006. Considering the nature of her crimes, plus a history of disciplinary problems, the parole board decided it would be better to keep her safely tucked behind bars, away from other people's children.